Hello, my name's Kevin. I'm going to be talking to you about AngularJS today. Have you guys worked with web applications before, developing them in the back end and front ends? Okay, cool. Have you guys used Backbone, Ember, jQuery? Okay, cool. Right, so I get a little context about my audience. So a little bit about myself. I'm primarily a Python JavaScript developer. I work with, I have a slight specialization in data visualizations, charts and graphs. I've worked in online video now for about 3 or 4 years. Like any respected internet denizen, I adore cats. And I work for a company called Tubular Labs. We're based out in Silicon Valley, California. And we do data and services around online video. More specifically, we have probably the most data about YouTube than anyone except for Google. To give you a reference point, we have 700, oh wait, that should say videos. 700 million videos indexed, and that accounts for 500 trillion views indexed day by day. And we can surface it all in our tool that we've built on top of a Python and AngularJS platform. So this is an example. I've searched for cat videos. And so you can see that among the 500 million videos we've referenced, 1.7 million of them have something to do with cats. And those account for 23.8 billion views. So about Angular. I don't know how much you've heard about Angular. It's a framework that has a lot of different components to it. Primary to it is the HTML compiler, which does all the fancy things that you'd want, like data binding and evaluating expressions dynamically. There's a dependency injection framework that'll allow you to reference your modules by name rather than by something like a require.js style of array includes. There's a resource module, which if you've used Backbone before, it's very similar to. A routing module, very similar to Backbone routing. They implement their own subset of jQuery Lite, and then a whole bunch of other things, all of which are exposed in their core modules. Yes?
In layman's terms, how would you describe a module?
So a module is a set of services that it exposes as one package. So, for example, the HTTP module exposes the ability to create XHR objects to allow you to make AJAX requests to web services. Or the injector library allows you to fetch modules by name out of the core reference implementation of it. So with that said, I'd like to give you like a small demo, starting from scratch for creating an Angular project. So we start by, can you read this? Okay. Making a HTML file. And this will all seem very familiar. Include the doc type, tell it that it's HTML5. And then we'll include the Angular library. And we'll say something like our own version of Hello World. Save that. Now we need to tell Angular where to be active on our page. So we'll tell Angular, be active on the whole root of the HTML DOM. So we'll call our app apps. And we'll say call our controller main. So a controller is a body of logic which will allow you to manipulate the scope of this particular body element and everything within it. And the app tells it exactly which module to reference and which, more specifically, where to pull the controller out of. So now we just need to make an app.js file. So we'll define a new module. We called it penapps. And it has no dependencies, so we'll give it an empty array. Let's reference this as our app. And now we'll define our controller. We called it main. And sometimes I have to remind myself I'm not writing in a compiled JS language. So this specific syntax here, where you include the body of the controller as a function, the arguments of the controller are evaluated with the dependency injector. So if I were to give it an arbitrary list of strings, it would try to pull out of the library of modules that it contains and include that within your controller. So in this case, I'm telling it, please go get the scope for our controller. If I were to include something like HTTP or some other module we've written specifically, it would go out and fetch that as well. But right now, all we need is the scope. So we can just say scope.user is. And the scope is.
What is that? Controller?
The controller is a body of logic which, appropriately enough, controls that particular DOM element and the things within it.
Okay.
So yeah, in this particular case, the main controller affects all the logic that happens within the body.
Oh, because you said main there and main there. Okay.
Yes, that's right. And now we just need to go out and get the actual Angular library. So we'll use Bower to install Angular. Oh, shoot. I think I need the internet for this. Actually, we'll just copy it over from another library that we have. Okay, great. And now we'll just run a static HTML server to serve our content. Oh, I've already got this running somewhere else. Okay, let's see. Okay, now if everything has gone according to plan, we can open it up. Let's just open up a new window. And we can see it says, hello penapps, just as planned. Great. But that's not exactly dynamic. We have user hard-coded to be something. So let's extend this a little bit to be something like a to-do list. So hello user, this is your to-dos. We'll include a list of things. And we'll hard-code a list of tasks to begin with, just to make sure that it all renders correctly. Great. So that's essentially what we want. Now we just need to make it dynamic. So we'll include in the scope a list of tasks to begin with. Let's call it tasks. And it'll be some JavaScript objects. Let's go with description. And now we can just loop over the tasks we've created here and create list elements for them. So we just say ng repeat and task in tasks. And this specific tasks references the scope tasks. So everything that would be a variable is going to be on the scope, and we can access it from our DOM. And then this will be the task description. Let's just make sure that works. Great. Now we want to be able to complete tasks, which would be nice. So let's just go ahead and reformat this slightly. And to show a task is complete, we'll strike through it with a line. So, and we'll do that with a class. So let's say a list has the class done when the item is done. And we'll need to data bind this particular checkbox to match the item. So we'll say ng model corresponds with when the item is done. Okay, great. Of course, a class isn't very much use if we don't have some styling to go with it, so we'll have to include link CSS file. Now let's just make a quick little CSS file. So we'll say when a list element has the class done, we'll decorate it with a strike through or a line through. Great. Let's pull it up, see if it works. Great. Oh, let me show you that command real fast. So in this case, it's a static file server that's built into Python. It's just python-m, simple HTTP server. And I'll include this all in a GitHub thing that you can access later if you want to reference it. Great, so now we see if we complete an item, it will strike through, showing us it's done. Now let's quickly add a way for us to add new items. So we'll just include another input box. And we'll bind this to, let's say, let's call it a new task. And then give it a button that we can press to indicate that we're done. But that's not quite all we need to do. We also need to ensure the button does something when we click it. So we'll just reference the ng-click directive and call the function add item, or add, let's call it add task. Great. Now all we need to do is create an actual function on the scope called addTask that will accomplish what we need it to do. And all we need to do is push a new task onto scope.tasks. And the description we're going to use is going to be this new task which we've added onto the scope. And after we're all done, we just need to reset the new task to be empty so that they can add another thing later. Great, let's see if this all works. Let's create a presentation for PenApps. And great, it adds onto our task list, and we can complete it just like every other task. So at this point, I'd like to show you a little bit more about directives. So everything I've referenced here, ng-app, ng-controller, ng-repeat, ng-class, ng-model, those are things we call directives, which are attached to a particular DOM element and modify the structure of it, the behavior of it, add logic to it. These are all things that are, these particular ng-whatever directives are built into the core library, but we can write our own and extend it ourselves. In particular, what we can do is create a custom element. So let's say this list item were more complex and we'd want to isolate the logic of it from our main application. What we'd really want is just a task item. And we want a task item for every task. And we want to bind it to the items that we're looping over. Great. So now we just need to move this markup somewhere else. Let's call it task item.html. We can get rid of the ng-repeat now and leave that alone. And now we'll create a new directive so that the HTML compiler knows what we're talking about when we say task item. So we'll just call a new directive. We called it task item. And what we return as the directive is an object describing our new task. So in this particular case, we're creating a new custom element. So we're restricting it to be an element tag. We're going to create a new scope for it. So directives can inherit from the parent scope, they can have the parent scope, or they can have their own isolated scope so that their logic never touches the main applications. It's isolated in a sense. In this particular case, the only thing the task item needs to know about is the item itself, which we've assigned to model here. So let's let the directive know about that. Great. Let's see. Oh, we also need to know what the markup is for this particular item. So we'll just tell it where it can pull the markup from. And we called it taskitem.html. Great. I can add more here. I can add a custom controller, a custom link function, which will allow it to modify the structure of the element before it's added to the DOM. I can tell it how to inherit different things from the parent. I can have it include its own libraries or depend on other directives, how to communicate with other controllers. But in this particular case, it doesn't need to do that, so we'll just keep it simple. Oh, that's not quite right. Oh, right, we called it model here, so we need to call it model here as well. Great. Oh, something's not quite right. Oh, we called it task, not item. Great. And now we can just create new tasks. And it all works as planned. So that's AngularJS in a nutshell. It's a very forward-looking framework for web applications, most particularly single-page apps. So it exists in the same world as Ember.js or React.js. It takes a slightly different tack in that all templates for Angular are just purely HTML. So anything that would be parsable by a browser is parsable by Angular. It differs from Ember.js in that all the objects we referenced are just plain old JavaScript objects. If you wanted to do something similar in Ember, you would have to create custom objects from the Ember library that will allow you to add getters and setters so that the framework would know when something changes. Angular knows when something is changed because it compiles the DOM into a bunch of expressions that it watches and evaluates. And every time one of them changes, it knows exactly where to place it within the DOM. And that's basically it. Are there any questions? Yes?
What would you, kind of off topic, but what would you say are some of the benefits or disadvantages of React.js as opposed to using AngularJS?
So you'd want to use React.js if performance were critical to you and you had something like thousands of items on a page. I think some research has been done in showing that more than 2,000 or I think it's 2,000 watchers on an Angular application, it starts to visibly slow down. This isn't a huge deal because once you have more than 2,000 watchers on a page, that means your app is exposing lots of more things than the human mind can comprehend, right, reasonably, in a reasonable fashion. It's also not too bad an issue because Angular is a forward-looking framework. Object.observe is in the roadmap for future JavaScript implementations. In fact, it's already in the latest Chromium Nightly build. Object.observe allows you to watch whenever an object changes and then respond to it appropriately, which allows Angular to no longer rely on dirty checking to evaluate the DOM. But React.js is a great framework if you need results now and you need performance now.
Can you go to app.js? What exactly scope dot refers to? It's like scope of the...
Oh, okay. So scope refers to the scope of this particular element that we've bound the controller to.
Oh, that's okay.
So everything within this body is within the scope of main.
Oh, I see.
And you can have subcontrollers. Those would inherit from the scope of the main controller. You can have subdirectives that would also inherit or not in the case of our particular task item.
Can you go to app.js again?
Sure. So scope is just an object that we're adding items to. And once we added those items to it, we can access it within our markup.
Okay. So here, like scope of tasks, for example, is like tasks are hard coded. How do you say integrate this with backends like Django?
Sure. So if we were doing something like Django, we would add the HTTP method and then make a call to our Django server. So in this particular case, let's say the URL is my tasks.
URL of you or of what?
The endpoint in which you're exposing the tasks. So we're supposing a world in which we didn't have scope.tasks,
Yeah.
and we had a server which served up our tasks.
Yeah, same like stores them in SQL.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And then exposes them in an AJAX interface.
Oh, okay.
Mm.
Alright.
Oh, are you saying like on initial upload? Or,
No, like we have Django app.
okay,
Like we have a model that basically stores all the tasks.
right.
So yeah, how does it interact with it?
Okay, so say we exposed it in a route called my tasks. Then we could say on success, get the data back. And then say in the data it had a tasks object. We would just say scope.tasks is equal to the result of our AJAX call.
Scope with task is equal to. Oh, okay. So it's not JSON or anything. It's the HTTP call.
Right, it's an HTTP call that returns a JSON body.
Oh, okay. Oh yeah, right.
Great. Any more questions? Awesome. Oh, oh, and the script tag?
So when you're through at AngularJS, is that just
Oh, so that's a library file, much like if we included jQuery as a separate external library file. In this particular case, we need to include the framework itself before we include any application logic.
and does this need to be the application?
I'm sorry, are you talking about the physical location of the script file, or? No, I mean, it could be anywhere. Like, typically you would grab this from a CDN or something like a Google CDN or a Cloudflare CDN. In this particular case, I'm just serving it up from my local machine. Awesome. Thanks for having me.